Good afternoon, everybody. I think we've got, let's see how many folks we have so far. Got 11 participants. It's 2:02, it's two past the hour. Eric, how do you feel about getting started?
Yeah, we'll start slow. If other people trickle in, they can feel totally comfortable, and we'll just make this kind of a casual conversation, hopefully, where people feel free, they can ask questions, and we'll just go where the conversation leads.
That sounds good. I've got a little bit of an intro to read, and maybe a few more people will filter in
Mhm.
while I read through that. So just want to say good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for joining us for the Student Association of Fire Ecology Connections webinar. My name is Andrew Johnson. I'm a PhD student at UC Berkeley, where I study the human dimensions of fire management. And I'm also a member of the National Safe Leadership Team who assisted with planning this webinar series. I'll be the moderator of the webinar as well. So this is the fourth of 6 webinars that SAFE is hosting this academic year. Our intent for these webinars is to create a forum for students and early career fire ecologists to hear from and engage with a diverse group of established professionals. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the SAFE website. All registered participants will be emailed a link to the recording once it's available, which typically takes around a week. Following Dr. Knapp's presentation, there will be time for questions and answers. Please feel free to add any questions you have to the Q&A chat throughout the presentation. There's no Q&A chat for this. You can just drop them in the chat. We might even go with a less formal option. As Eric said earlier, he's open to having questions throughout his presentation. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Eric Knapp. Eric Knapp is a research ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service based in Redding, California. Research bridges the fields of fire management and silviculture with topics including forest change in the absence of fire, historical fire history, effects of different methods of prescribed burning, and evaluating performance of forest treatments such as thinning and burning. He has worked for the federal government, both the USGS and US Forest Service, for 24 years, and currently also serves on the board of the Association of Fire Ecology organization. As a student and early career researcher familiar with his work, I'm very excited to hand over the floor to Dr. Knapp to begin this talk. Thanks, and it off to you, Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, like I say, feel free to pipe in, raise your hand or throw something in the chat, and if you want me to elaborate on any topic. But I'm going to share a presentation that I put together for this, and let's see if that pops up for everyone. Are we good?
Yes, we are.
Yeah. Okay. So Andrew asked me just to put together a presentation that maybe gives people a better idea of what life as a Forest Service research scientist might be like. So what I thought I'd do is I'd just throw together some sort of career highlights to illustrate, my trajectory, and I'll just talk about, various decisions that I've made along the way to get to where I currently am in this field. And if people have questions about other aspects of it, yeah, just we'll talk about it. But let's see. So yeah, this is essentially, I'm going to just give you a sort of a greatest hits of a couple of research projects that I got involved in. But first of all, I think it might be useful to just talk about how Forest Service research differs from the rest of the agency, the management side of the agency. And because a lot of people don't really know that the research branch and the National Forest System branch are actually two totally separate arms of the agency. And that was set up that way, by design. It was so that the science was independent of management. Can speak the hard truth. And so we don't we're not underneath we don't well, I think you can kind of see the value of being independent. It also means that our science it tends to be respected as over a broader array of disciplines. It's not just the managers, but we work for the American public and anyone who wants, solid science to manage landscapes. Um, so my particular career is a little bit of an odd one. Like I was telling Andrew and the rest of the folks before we started, is I got my PhD at UC Davis in 1993, but at that time there weren't any fire ecology programs or fire science programs. So my PhD actually happened to be in genetics. I was a plant breeder. And but then going through my PhD, I realized I'm a person who really likes being out in the woods. While I was doing my doctorate work, it became much more of a lab oriented endeavor, and I decided to retrain myself as an ecologist. And so I went and I apologize. It looks like my microphone is defaulting to another microphone, but hopefully you can still hear me. Uh, so I ended up taking a postdoc in an ecology lab at UC Davis, where I bridged the fields of ecology and genetics, looking at sort of native plant restoration and the genetics of that. And I also was a lecturer at Davis. I taught field and laboratory methods in ecology. And I hoped that would land me a job. And it turned out I was at that time looking for academic positions. I really enjoyed teaching. I didn't land anything, so I after that I took an environmental consulting job for a year, and I thought that was really great work. I was really stimulated by it, but one of my supervisors at that time, he mentioned that if I continue on the way I am, pretty soon my billable hours are going to get too expensive for me to spend much time in the field, and I said that I started sensing, as someone who really likes being outside, that might be the end of the road. So I switched focus, and I ended up taking a job with the U.S. Geological Survey, and it was my first foray into federal science. And so USGS has a similar scientific division as U.S. Forest Service, but they work on Department of the Interior lands rather than Department of Agriculture lands, which is the Forest Service. So I ended up being based in Sequoia National Park and over 4 great years, and I managed a prescribed fire study. And at that point, I just had a solid, science background. I didn't know much about fire at all. But while I was at Sequoia Park, I ended up, getting my red card and going to my week-long, fire training, and I became just really immersed in fire science just by experiencing prescribed fire. And so that really was the pivotal time for me. It gave me the skills necessary to compete for the Forest Service research scientist job that I currently have in Reading, and I've been here since 2004 in Reading as a research ecologist. So I could say that my career is I'm kind of a self-taught fire scientist, and I think there are quite a few other scientists of that realm. They find fire at some point, and it's like, wow, this is a fascinating thing to study, and you use your skills as a scientist to approach a new area, a new problem. So yeah, my title is I'm a research ecologist. I do a lot of work on, as Andrew mentioned, I work a lot in fire effects, but also silviculture and sort of integrating fire management, silviculture, fuels management, and really, the objective of my job is just to develop and run a research program that addresses management issues and questions. So it's a pretty applied job. But I have a great deal of freedom to choose areas of study and to choose those areas of studies, to typically interact with managers, learn what their questions are, and then design a study around those questions to give them answers. And one of the nice things about being a federal scientist is we have a long history since just about when the Forest Service was formed. They also had a science branch. So we have long-term data sets and long-term plot networks. And if you're a forest scientist, that's especially helpful. We're not just dealing with like a 3-year grant. And so I found that incredibly helpful, and I'll take you through an example next about how that has tied into my research. But anytime we do a larger research project, we often, not like academic scientists, we oftentimes have to write grants to acquire outside funding and collaborate with other agencies and other universities because we're a small research organization. And for us, to advance in our career, federal research scientists, they go through this process where every 5 or so years, you go up against a panel of your peers. It's a little bit like a tenure hearing in academia. And they just look at where you are, what you've done, not only in the last 5 years, but over your career. And really the panel, the intent of it is to just get a better sense of the stature of your science, about how it's viewed in the scientific world. How many publications have you produced? What outreach have you done? What's your stature? How has my science moved the field forward or changed the way lands are managed? Is what we're graded on. So yeah, I'm going to start out in the woods where I like to be. And this is a picture from a forest that I went to as a graduate student in a forest ecology class by my professor, Michael Barber. He wrote several textbooks. I don't know if any of you are familiar with him. You probably use different textbooks now. But we went to this forest and we camped here for a night or two. And we spent the days just putting in plots and asking questions. And this is kind of an interesting forest where you can see the big old growth trees. You got a big ponderosa pine in front of you, but you have a bunch of little trees mixed in, a lot of fuel on the ground. There's not a lot of understory vegetation growing. You got a burnt stub of a tree on the right, but no other real evidence of fire. And so at that time, this professor, he really challenged us to think about how this forest has changed over time. What's different now than it used to be? Is this forest healthy? Is it resilient to disturbance? And so I think my team, we spent some time just sort of looking at the demographics of the stand and looking at cored a few trees, look at the age structure of the stand. And I think we determined that, yeah, a lot of these young trees are probably in growth, and we try to envision what this forest used to look like. And I just remember it was kind of my first perspective on maybe how much forests had changed over time. But then, I came to my Forest Service research career, and like I said, with research scientists, we oftentimes have access to these amazing data sets. And so Carl Skinner, who was one of my fellow scientists here in Reading, and when I first got to Reading, he showed me this map drawer full of these old maps that were drawn by the early scientists. And so this is this map example drawn by a team led by this forester named Duncan Dunning, who was in the Forest Service scientist from 1915 to 1950. And this is an incredibly detailed map of an old growth forest in 1929. He not only mapped the location of every tree in that forest, but he mapped all the down vegetation. And you see some of these little circles, like that one I have my cursor on. That's a ceanothus. That's a shrub. Here's Ceanothus parvifolius. We also have in dotted lines little patches of regeneration. White fir, incense cedar is this patch. You also have all the downed logs mapped, every tree location mapped. And along this transect in the middle of this inset, they even counted the numbers of stems of every herbaceous plant. And this was done over 40 acres of old growth forest. So I thought, wow, that's incredible. And figure out what these forests used to look like. I actually have a data set that's over 80 years old that actually shows me what that forest was actually like in 1929. And I was pretty blown away by that. And it was like, here's the answer to all these questions I was posed as a graduate student. And so one of the first things I did as a research scientist is I decided, heck, I'm going to try to find these plots. I'm going to try to see what they look like today. So that took me back down to this Stanislaw Tuolumne experimental forest where that previous picture was taken from. And I did find these plots. And they ended up being these old methods of cutting studies. These three plots, they were all established in 1929. This methods of cutting 11 plot was one that was intended to replicate what was being done in the Sierra Nevada at that time. Heavy cut, which is they took everything, they cut everything merchantable in a stand, leaving every tree that was less than about 20 inches in diameter. And then they compared that to this light economic thin plot where they only took the highest value pines and they left all the big firs and the big cedars. And then next to it is like this methods of cutting 9 plot, whereas a Forest Service preferred thin, where they did also cut a lot of the big overstory trees. At that time, they thought a lot of the big trees were over mature. They weren't really doing much anymore. So they cut the, big, 70, 80-inch pines down. Pines that were still fast growing. And, that was kind of a preferred alternative. So yeah, it's mixed conifer forest, 5,700 feet elevation in the Sierra Nevada. And we went back in, and I found the plots. You can see on the left here, you see one of the original hand-stamped metal tags. And reading through the history of these plots, I realized that these tags were oftentimes made by, one of the foresters had his kids along with him, and while his father was nailing the tags on the tree, the kid was pounding these tags out and handing them to his dad to bang on the tree. And there, 85 years later, there it still is. So we use some modern technology, set up kind of like a total station with GPS and a laser, and we remap these stands. And we found these original maps that were developed with a compass and a chain were actually really accurate. And we found all the data associated with them in the National Archives. We started putting together an example, of what these plots used to look like. And so they're among the oldest plots with individually tagged trees that are known to still exist in the Forest Service system here in California. And instead of having to speculate on what a forest has changed over time, we can show how it's changed. Like here's 1 acre in one of those maps in 1929, and you can see this really diverse forest with these groups of trees at different age classes, widely spaced big trees, gaps, all in an acre. Cross section, it looks something like this. Today, after they cut the big trees and a bunch of small trees grew in, that's what that plot looked like in 2008, and that's what it looked like in cross section. And it just gave me a real interesting perspective on, not only has the density of these forests changed, but the structural diversity of our forests has completely changed as well. And I started linking that to, habitat for wildlife and other species. And so this led me to a lot of the work that I'm doing today. And just to give you another illustration of how this has changed. 1929, one thing we saw is there was all these little gaps in the forest, and these gaps had highlight environments. They had a lot of shrubs in them. And you can see by by 2007, 2008, pretty much all those gaps have filled in with trees. It's like a continuous forest. So to understand, why this has all happened, one thing that we wanted to do too is just to understand the disturbance regime, and that's one thing that my lab does as well. It's a skill that I learned from my predecessors in Sequoia National Park, and then Carl Skinner here at the Forest Service lab, and others. But for those of you who don't know how this is done, essentially we go to old stumps and downed logs that have these blackened cat faces like you see on the right, and cut the top off of cut through one of these cat faces. So each of these horizontal lines is one of these cross sections of a tree, and each of the vertical checks is a fire registered by that tree. And then when you do that for a number of different samples, you get what's called a composite or a fire return interval. So this particular graph showed at this site that the median fire return interval was about every 6 years until about 1850. In 1850, that was obviously the gold rush time. Indigenous depopulation. There were a few fires since. We still have lightning igniting fires, but the last fire at this site was in 1889. And so you go from a forest that had fire every 6 years to now suddenly not having fire in over 100 years. And you can kind of get a sense of why the forest is so different today and why it's burning differently today. So like I mentioned, that's one of the things that my lab does is we do dendrochronology work, and this just shows a slab being cut out of a tree, and one of these cross-dated slabs that we produced from one site west of Reading here with, you see the fire scars and then all the dates of those fire scars. In this particular site, the last fire was in 1897, which is pretty close to that Stanislaus site. Excuse me. But another thing we did is with all those maps also showed all the downed wood in 1929. So we went back in and looked at how's that downed wood changed over time. And so in 1929, that's already 40 years after the last fire. So this is probably more wood on the ground than used to exist on the site when you had 6-year fire return interval. Now you go 123 years since the last fire, 83 years after logging, and you realize that there's a lot more wood on the forest floor. A lot of that wood, it tends to be these smaller diameter pieces. But it starts to link you to the fuel change that's gone on over time. And so, yeah, we know that there's the excess fuel accumulation has led to the types of fire behavior we see today. And the scene like on the left it was probably not something that was ever witnessed in a time where you had 6 years with fire burning every 6 years. That much fuel would have never accumulated. And another thing I like to do in my job is to look at the historical literature, and I think we can learn a lot from that. Like I love this quote by Sudworth from 1900. He wrote, "The only food for these fires is a scanty fall of pine and fir needles, irregular patches of low conifer seedlings, and chaparral. In general, these materials limit the fires to surface burning." Well, you can obviously see that, like the rim fire in this picture here, and that fire is a different beast today. And we have a really good understanding of why that is, just looking at the fuel loads, how the forests have changed over time. So these were pretty fundamental experiences to my career. Another historical quote and some pictures. These are pictures that Duncan Dunning took of the old growth forest in 1929 before it was logged. And a couple other Forest Service scientists, Shao and Kotok, in 1924, they wrote, "The virgin forest is uneven aged, or at best even aged by small groups, and patchy and broken, hence fairly immune from extensive devastating crown fire." I always love this quote because what it did is it seemed to attribute this immunity from extensive devastating crown fire in part to this patchiness and this brokenness of the stand. And that's something that we saw with those old historic maps. You had these groups of trees, but they were interspersed with small gaps. So you can imagine like a fire getting into the crowns in any one of those groups, it really has nowhere to go. But these pictures, I mean, they also give you some idea of the diversity of conditions. I think importantly, like a lot of the old pictures that we see in the literature or in the common press, you see these widely spaced big trees, and you can look forever through the stand. But more often, I think the photographers didn't take pictures like this third one here on the right, where there was also dense clumps of trees that potentially provided habitat for other species of animals. They just were separated. They weren't continuous with the other high density areas, and I think that was key. So we decided, it's like, well, how can we use this data and to maybe restore structural complexity with thinning or prescribed fire in a way that just increases the resilience to fire and other disturbances, but it also helps to maintain or enhance the habitat for wildlife. And like a lot of forest thinning is sometimes seen as in conflict with wildlife concerns. And I looked at those old maps and I thought, why should it be? I mean, all that habitat was there before. Why can't we create that habitat with thinning if we just approach thinning in maybe a little different way? So, like today, for mitigating crown fire hazard, it's typically done is reducing the amount of ladder fuels, raising the height to base of live crown, which been done in the stand here, and you space the crowns of overstory trees. But what tends to be done is the trees are spaced individually, and it definitely works to change fire behavior, but it results in a stand that's maybe just doesn't have that complexity that we saw in those old historic maps. And so a group of us got together and we said, well, let's work with the forest and design another prescription that's focused on generating variability, and we call it the high variability prescription. Sure. Rather than spacing each tree individually. So we have a high variability thin where we produce more of a group and gap structure. Compare that to a low variability thin and an untreated control. And we put the study in right around these old historic maps, which are our reference. So it's on 250 acres of ground. And then we did that with prescribed fire and without prescribed fire. And one of the reasons we put prescribed fire in there is we wanted to see, like, to what extent can we generate some of that heterogeneity with just fire alone? Because some of the publics were wondering, it's like, why do you have to log in order to generate heterogeneity? If the forest is lacking fire, can't we just put fire back in and expect to get that same structure back? So we wanted to test that. So in this particular project, it was logged in 2011. And it was a group of us, fellow scientists. We got the other, like the wildlife biologists on the forest, the botanists on the forest. We all marked the stand. We just looked at those old pictures of those maps, and we kind of marked a little bit. It was like more like art than a hardcore science or a basal area target. And we had just attempted to recreate some of that structure. And then we put prescribed fire in the stands again in 2013. And yeah, the picture on the left here is me holding the drip torch. Sometimes the managers will give me a torch and it makes it a good day. They just see it puts a smile on my face. And there's really no better way to learn about fire than actually using fire and observing fire. And so that's one thing as a research scientist that I do whenever every chance I get is to go out on prescribed burns or wildfires, because I feel like it makes for a lot better papers if you really can understand how fire behaves in these systems. So, yeah, so I envy sometimes people coming out of graduate school that have a fire background. You spend a few years on a fire crew and then go to grad school. I think that puts you in a place that's probably much improved over where I came from. And so just having that experience is invaluable. But anyway, back to the variable density thinning study. On the left here, the sun is control. That's what we started with. On the right is a more even thin or low variability where we space the crowns of individual trees. And then we have two units here that were thin with this variable prescription. And you can see
the difference. You have small groups or small gaps interspersed with areas of high density where more trees were left, clumped together than potentially would be in a normal prescription. The basal area and the density are the same for those two thinning prescriptions. They just vary in how the trees were arranged. And I just have to add that, then we spend a lot of time measuring these plots. And who does that fun work? A lot of the field work is done by people we hire, folks straight out of school, perhaps some of you on this call. And we hire them seasonal help to get experience working in research and in science and in forestry. I like to spend probably a month of the summer out of the field as well with my crew. So I probably spend more time out in the woods than your average scientist, but I feel like it's invaluable, and I like to make the time to be out there. And without the crews of people, we wouldn't have the data to show how the treatments are actually performing. Like this is a graph that's showing that now here's our control, high variability, low variability, with and without prescribed fire. And you can see that in 2016, we started in terms of like the understory cover, that we're trying to restore some of that understory shrub cover that used to be in these forests that disappeared because of the density of the forest, low light. That this high variability thinning with prescribed fire is starting to pull ahead. And so you can start seeing that, just the higher light environment, the opening created by thinning, as well as the burning, which stimulates the seed in the seed bank to germinate, are probably both necessary to start restoring the shrub cover. We also have some opportunities when we have big studies like this, where we can see how do they actually perform in the real world. And in California, we had this big drought in about 2012 to 2015, and a lot of trees got hit by bark beetles. Probably, maybe some of you saw it on the news. Just sometimes forests that are just all turning brown. And those bark beetles also hit our forest. And so we monitored it between 2014 and 2018. We looked at tree mortality of our different treatments. And the one thing you can see, here's the basal area on the left. And you can see that these are the two controls, with and without fire. The basal area started crashing in the controls. We lost 23% of the basal area in the controls on average. But in the thinned units, with and without prescribed fire, we lost some trees, but that was balanced by growth. And so it was kind of a net, no gain. Historical reference basal area was up here. So, these basal areas are still on the low side just because it takes hundreds of years to grow a 70 to 80-inch tree. So that's yet to come. But what was cool about this project is because a lot of folks were attributing the bark beetle mortality in the Sierra to bark beetles and climate change. And what we were actually able to show them is it was actually climate change interacting with excess tree density. That if you didn't have the high abundance of trees, that you actually didn't have the same level of mortality. So I think that was a really valuable thing to understand. I think that managers have utilized. So another thing I do is, this is a more recent project where, last one I showed you is how treatments perform to bark beetles. Well, we also have the opportunity sometimes to look at how treatments perform to wildfires. So we have another one of these big silvicultural studies up on the Klamath National Forest. And this one also has untreated controls. It has a big tree emphasis thin, a pine emphasis thin, a pine emphasis thin with prescribed fire, and a fire-only treatment. And these are big units. They're all about 100 acres in size. So this antelope fire was a lightning strike. And then I'll just show you, it blew north in a prefrontal wind event, and it got into some of our units. And then the front came through, and the fire went changed direction 90 degrees and went the other direction. And then in subsequent days, it filled in and it essentially burned the entire study, but it burned it over a range of conditions from really extreme wind-driven fire to more, fire without a lot of wind, but still pretty dry. So again, we got out there and we remeasured all of these plots just to see what happened. And then we can actually say with data now that how did treatments, did they reduce fire severity? And the data show, yes, it did. For example, on the left here, we have this graph showing probability of mortality. Well, untreated control had high mortality. On the opposite extreme, we have a thin with prescribed fire treatment had much lower mortality. And so if you treat both the crown fuels and the surface fuels with thinning and fire, you have the biggest impact. If you treat just the crown fuels, you're intermediate. If you treat just the surface fuels, you're intermediate. So it really shows that you have to treat both the crown fuels and the surface fuels for a maximum effect. And then same with the other metrics. Average bowl char height gives you kind of an idea of the intensity of the fire. You can see the control was a lot higher than with prescribed fire, with the others intermediate. Percent of crown volume consumed, that gives you an idea of the amount of torching. And again, any treatment really reduced the amount of torching in the plots. The right one, you might not be able to see because it's partly hidden, but that shows the percentage of crown volume affected. That's how much of the crown is turned brown, not necessarily, it might just be scorched, not necessarily torched, but it could be torched too. So this is an overview of those studies.
But was a untreated control. The unit on the right was one that was thinned with a pine emphasis thin, and then followed with 2 rounds of prescribed burning. And you can see the benefits that treatment has on the outcome. Yeah, one last little project that I'd mentioned is the managers came to us and they were interested in bringing fire back into young plantations. And there's a lot of plantations on the National Forest System, both from past logging, when we used to do little clear cuts, back in the 1980s and 90s. We don't do that anymore, but the plantations as a result. Also, there's lots of plantations that have been replanted after wildfires. And the question is when is too early, to get fire back into these stands where we don't kill the trees. And anytime you plant a tree, managers just don't really want to see you killing that tree with fire. So pretty critical question to know. And we said, well, we'll just put some plots in and monitor it into areas that where you are bringing fire into plantations, and we'll learn. So that's what we did. And we have plantations of different ages, different sizes, and we've now burned 9 of those, and we're following those over time. And then we can produce graphs like this for managers. What factors influence the initial tree mortality? We looked at shrub cover, humidity, quadratic mean diameter, field moisture, grass cover, field load, forb cover. And you might not be able to see the figure on the right side of the figure, but one thing that was curious to me is with quadratic mean diameter, we actually saw higher mortality in areas with larger trees. And yeah, the higher mortality when you have higher fuel loads, that makes sense. But the QMD one, it didn't initially. But then you start thinking about it is, where do you have higher fuels in plantations? It tends to be areas where you have bigger trees, because that's where you start developing a fuel bed. You start getting a deeper litter bed. And so really, this is like a fuel-driven system where the amount of mortality is, a lot of cases, it seems to be driven by how those fuels are ignited. So we were able to point out to the managers that it's really the ignition strategies that you use to affect the amount of crown scorch. It was crown scorch that was causing any mortality that we were seeing. Overall, the mortality was pretty low with the size trees. But where they got too much heat on the ground, they did get some patches of mortality. And so we know that there are ignition strategies you can use for minimizing crown scorch. You can light fewer strips simultaneously. You can put more time between those strips and use more backing fire. You can use a strategy called a tree-centered spot firing, where you ignite right around the base of the trees and you let the fire creep out from the individual trees. And so the maximum intensity happens to be in these interstitial spaces between trees, not right underneath trees. We generate a little more intensity and move fire along faster by this flanking fire behavior, which you saw in this right-hand one. We also used aerial spear dispensers for some of the burns. And that's a challenge because when you have a helicopter up, you tend to want to maximize the amount of fire for the limited amount of time, which can, if the conditions are right, lead to a lot of scorch if you drop too many of those flaming ping pong balls. And that's one thing we learned too. So like burning when the air temperature is cool or when there's a breeze can help also minimize the amount of scorching. So we're working with managers to sort of fine tune their burning prescriptions using these data. And and then I sometimes get involved in other projects that just come up, and not because I'm trained in them at all, but in 2018 we had the Carr fire, which hit my town of Reading, and we also had the Camp fire that burned like 18,000 homes in Paradise, which isn't too far away from Reading. And we didn't really see any teams were utilizing the information that CAL FIRE, our state agency, puts out to, looking at home loss. And so we asked the question, it's like, can we learn something about why houses burn in wildfires and what can we do about it? And so we actually took the data of houses that were destroyed, houses that were not destroyed, and looked at some variables like the distance of houses to each other, the distance of a house to the nearest destroyed structure, and the amount of canopy cover overhead, and to see what relationships we could find. And we discovered that really what's the strongest effect in these fires is how close you are to a neighboring structure that burns, which gave us the idea that a lot has to do with like radiant heat produced by another structure. And I think what people don't realize is that in an urban setting, the amount of fuel in a home, it dwarfs the amount of fuel in the wildlands. And we tend to be focused on the wildland fuels. But it's really, once a house catches on fire, that's in a huge amount of fuel. And then that then affects the neighboring house. And that same concept, it really came to play in the latest, the Los Angeles fires, where you had closely spaced houses and you had a lot of house-to-house fire spread. So just some final thoughts before we go to questions. And unfortunately, I shared my whole screen. So I apologize if you throw in stuff in the chat. I'm not reading the chat, but I'll get out of this in just a second. And we will just have a open it up. But yeah, I mean, I'm just give you kind of the career looks like as a research ecologist who focuses on fire. There are a few of us in my agency that do that, but there's also research wildlife biologists. There's research foresters. We have research social scientists and research entomologists, meteorologists, economists. So it runs the whole gamut, and we all focus on different things. And then people might ask, well, do you need a PhD to be a research scientist? And these days, I think the answer is probably yeah. That's not always been the case. I mean, I have some good examples of people who have maybe had a master's but spent a lot of years in fire, and they had this great integration, and they knew enough about the scientific method and enough about fire that they became a really great research scientist. And one of my mentors, Carl Skinner, sort of fits in that ballpark. But usually you need a PhD to be a research scientist, but it doesn't mean there aren't jobs for folks in research who don't have PhDs. Like we also have technical and professional staff that are just totally vital in helping carry out the research. There are crew leaders. They generally help to collect the data and process the data. It's a scientist.
And so I'm just to add that in these federal science research jobs, they're in some ways it's like being in academia. But the federal research jobs, they tend to fit best for people who are really interested in applied land management questions, and those who find a reward in serving the public. We're asked a lot, to be part of to give talks to public audiences, and so that's just a big part of our effort too. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and hopefully that generated some thoughts that people might have.
Thanks so much, Eric. That was a really great talk. That was really interesting. Your story was great. I like how it was woven into your research and all of your thoughts that came from that. There is one question in the chat, but I will open it up to folks who want to ask in person first over Zoom, and then I will read the question in the chat. If you have a question for Eric, there's a small group, so please just unmute yourself and go for it.
Yeah, I can read that question too. Do I see a need in local management units increasing worker skills in prescribed fire monitoring? Yeah, I mean, there's some attempt on doing prescribed fire monitoring, but I'd say those efforts are pretty small scale. That's one of the advantages of Forest Service research is we sometimes, if managers have a question about that, of how to use understanding of where the prescribed fires are they meeting objectives, they can bring the scientists in, like our team, and we'll put in the plots for them, monitor them, and then we'll give them the information. And so that's like what I'm doing with this fire and plantations work. It's really a project that's directed by the folks on the ground, and we're just helping them produce science that they can use. I mean, there's definitely some monitoring that happens, but I'd say that the budget for that is not high. Like locally, our state agency, CAL FIRE, has a monitoring branch too, and they're trying to do some work to understand if their fires are meeting objectives.
Please go ahead, Andrea.
Hi, Dr. Knapp, thank you so much for the presentation. It was really interesting. I was curious if you had any advice for, places for very early career, students to look as far as opportunities right at this moment.
Yeah, may I ask, like, where are you in school? You said early.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for like graduate students, looking for seasonal jobs or internships, things like that.
Well, that's a great question. And, I would say that like if I would have known that there were seasonal field jobs in the field that I am now in, I don't think I would have floundered for years, like as a geneticist, and before I found my calling. So I would totally recommend people to take a seasonal position in an area that they really enjoy, and it just gives you an opportunity, like working on the ground every day to just develop your internal library of how things work, especially if you have great mentors that you can learn from. Totally invaluable. And I, just these jobs, they also lead to other opportunities. I mean, a lot of it, I know we all have, a lot of people that I know, they are in their position today because someone that they worked for in the past told them of a research job opportunity, passed something on to them. I know this day in the internet age, you can probably learn about what's going on, what jobs are open pretty much anywhere, but there's so much happening. Developing a network where people are happy to pass on opportunities for you is really important too. But yeah, field time. I'm a real big proponent of field time.
How much time do you get to spend in the field these days? You yourself?
Uh, I probably spend about a month of my year in the field.
That's a lot.
And it doesn't see, well,
Yeah.
it is probably on the higher end for a lot of research scientists because, a lot of us in the research sciences branch, we're managing the folks who are on the ground having the fun. But I get jealous. I want to be out there with them. And I feel like that helps the science too. It's just so I make the effort to be out in the woods, and I probably could be more productive in terms of publications if I was in the office more. But I feel like it makes my papers more relevant if I'm not in the office as much and I'm out in the woods. And so I try to find that balance. And also, it just, I believe in finding a career that matches your personality and interests. And one of my interests is in being outside as much as I can. Any other burning questions that someone wants to ask about
I guess
this?
maybe this isn't a fully developed thought, but I'm going to try anyways. You're in your like career transition from, you were a geneticist, you discovered fire. Was that at all like a transition for you, or was it easy to go from one thing into the next? And do you think being a geneticist helped?
Uh, it was a major transition, and it was kind of a gradual transition, but I don't feel like I feel like I really could have gotten a job, and I mean I've gotten my PhD in any field. Just the what graduate school did for me is it helped me learn the scientific method. It helped me analyze data, and I could really apply that to anything. It helped me learn how to ask a researchable question. And so, yeah, a PhD in genetics, I don't think really helped me. It didn't have to be in genetics. It could have been in any field, but I think the skills you learn in graduate school can help you with that. The one thing I will say is that initially, like I was saying, I was intending to go into academia, but I realized like in academia, I think they value more your like where you have got your PhD in. I was looking for ecology jobs where I got my PhD in ecology, and they would look at my CV and say, PhD in genetics, what's up? Uh, they want their people to have their degrees in pedigreed programs, and so that's more of a thing in academia. Whereas I found in research, they were more interested in what I had accomplished, that I could. And so the fact that I worked in Sequoia National Park and I wrote a bunch of papers on season of prescribed fire effects mattered more to the Forest Service research scientist branch than the fact that I had a PhD in genetics. They were willing to overlook that.
Set yourself up, I guess, to make the transition. Is that a good takeaway there?
Yeah, I mean, one takeaway is that don't pigeonhole yourself into any particular thing. Follow your dreams. Um, I I could have said, well, I got my PhD in genetics. I'm going to have to work in genetics because that's where I got my PhD. You don't have to do that. And I think a lot of people who maybe have non-traditional degrees, I mean, the world's open to you.
Eric,
Go ahead, Matt.
so Eric, I'm curious how you kind of perceive your lab. So when I hear you talk about your lab and the work you've been doing for the last 20 odd years, it really strikes me as similar to how a lot of academics structure their lab and how they drive it. Not so much from the limited experience I have of talking with research ecologists, how they kind of operate in their day to day. Do you think is that kind of a fair assessment? Are you more on the academic edge of what folks do in the federal government?
Well, it's quite different in that, obviously I'm right now I'm co-located with the Shasta Trinity National Forest. So I don't go down the hall and talk to other people who have PhDs. When I go out of my office, I go down the hall and talk to the fire shop. And so what it does is it creates a link where I can better understand their questions and learn about their questions. And so I can become more focused on uh, what's getting people out in the woods rather than sort of an academic question that might come up in the hallways of a university. And so it really tends to focus my work on more applied questions. But as far as like a lab, I might have kind of referred it in that way, and that I do have an area outside of my office where we have a little dendrochronology set up. A difference too in academia is I spend 100% of my time on research, versus a lot of academics. They have teaching responsibilities. But I'm an adjunct faculty member at a Cal Poly Humboldt, so I have connections to academia. I mentor graduate students. I have served on, I think, 9 master's committees, and so I do that part of it too. And I'll occasionally go down to Humboldt to give a lecture, or to Davis. But I do, more of my time is spent doing science. But, in other ways, it's kind of similar because in order to do a big research project, I really need to, like work with academics or on my own. I write research grants. I have to bring money in, just like any academic. I see one other question in the chat. Maybe I'll read that. It's like, so much of the Dixie Fire in 21 burned in the lands that include the Quincy Library Group treatment units. Do you have an understanding of the QLG objectives and their relationship with green tree survival? I, I, I know that landscape. I don't know if I totally understand the question. I have been on some tours in QLG lands after the Dixie Fire, and I saw, how they used some of the treatments to anchor burnouts, that ended up stopping the Dixie Fire in spots. So I know that the treatments were useful. And I think there's been some studies that have looked at how the treatments performed. My suspicion it's similar to what's written in a lot of the literature, that yeah, the treatments do reduce severity. If you add prescribed fire to the mix, it reduces severity the most. And I think that's sort of generally been found across a lot of ecosystems in the West and a lot of fires. And I don't know if that gets at what your question is. Is there any more? Feel free to come on the mic.
All right, Eric, we are at time.
Okay.
So if folks don't have any more questions, I just want to say thanks from SAFE, from everyone who's attending. Just thanks so much for making the time to come and present to students and tell us about your experience. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity. And I would say to anyone still out there is, if you have particular questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm happily, or give me a call. I would love to chat one-on-one. I benefited from a lot of those kind of interactions through my career, and I'm always interested in helping out others who want to make their way in this field.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Yeah.
Okay.